I see that we'll have a stream recording feature in LivePeer very shortly, so we can
Right.
do this programmatically instead of hitting the extra record button.
Should we just
Nice.
stream on staging and have it recorded? Probably not.
Cool. We're live. And we're also recording. So I think we can get started. I have the link to the LIP agenda here, and I'm just going to drop it in the Zoom chat in case anyone hasn't seen that yet. Doug made a good note in the community governance channel before this that in terms of LIP candidates, we are a little sparse there right now. So I think we can spend some time talking about the sole LIP candidate that's there right now. But I think we can expect to use most of the time on this call on the open discussion period. And prior to the start of the call, there was a few suggestions added for that section in 3 different categories. So I believe Doug added a few and I added 1 or 2 as well. So I expect that we can use most of the time talking about those topics, but we can probably get started with the one LIP candidate that we do have. And that is LIP 56, which was the reward period LIP that was originally created to relieve some of the gas cost burden on orchestrators for calling reward every day. So just to rehash, orchestrators have to call reward every round right now, and each round is roughly a day, and pay the associated Ethereum transaction gas cost for calling reward. And that's happened for the entirety of the lifespan of the LivePeer protocol, but it was definitely a lot more onerous in the past couple of months with higher Ethereum gas prices due to kind of the rise in DeFi and generally an increase in transaction volume on Ethereum. So this LIP was created a while ago, and it has sort of been on the back burner, mainly due to competing priorities elsewhere. And last update here was that I originally created the LIP and was championing it, but Nico had started driving forward the technical diligence required here in order to assess, like, if we want to reduce the gas cost for calling reward for orchestrators, what is the best way to go about it? And Nico had pressed forward a little bit previously, but it's been on the back burner since. So perhaps the best thing to do here is to get a sense of where this LIP is currently at, and then we can segue into where this falls from a prioritization standpoint in terms of how useful we think it is for the network in the short term. So Nico, I don't know if you're prepared for this, but would you want to give a quick update on where this LIP is at today, and yeah, how you've thought about it previously?
Yeah, sure. So I think where we left off with this LIP in the last LIP call was that we said that we would publicly share the updated design. So that has happened. And that design itself is still very much the same. So you would have a reward period, and you would have the next reward period to call reward for the previous reward periods. And the reward period would be an amount of rounds. So not much has changed to that design. It is public, so people can discuss it if they wish to. And I think what's next for this LIP is get some feedback on what is out there currently.
We have an updated design that was published in the discussion thread for LIP 56. And it's largely, I think it largely stays true to the original proposal, except the main differences are at smart contract implementation level, where I believe this design also includes a separation of concerns for the minter contract, right? Where right now the minter contract serves as sort of the central bank for the LivePeer system. And it also is responsible for managing the monetary policy for LPT. So it controls the inflation schedule. And as a part of the updated design, I believe there's now a proposed separation so that the inflation management responsibility is carried out by a separate contract, and the minter can just serve as kind of a really, really bare bones dumb bank that holds all the funds. And the purpose of that is, I believe there's some utility for implementing LIP 56, and that I think it might make it easier, but there's also some potential benefits for future flexibility. Is that about right, Nico, or am I off base at any point there?
It's one of the discussion topics right now, whether we should separate that into its own LIP that is connected to a reward round period LIP. But the current proposal itself hasn't split that up yet, so it's still one LIP for now.
Right, so the current proposal does not have two separate LIPs. So there are not two separate LIPs for this right now, but it is the case that in the latest design, the proposal is to separate out inflation management logic from the minter, or is that not the case?
Yes, that is the case currently. So the plan is to separate that logic out, but it's not a separate LIP currently.
Right, so the current design separates inflation management logic out of the minter, and there is a question of whether that should be its own LIP. Okay, cool. Great, so that's where this LIP is at. The design is available. There hasn't really been a feedback process for it, but it is available for discussion. So it feels like now the question is, okay, we have this updated design and we need feedback on it. Where does this LIP fall in kind of the list of priorities for the network right now? And this might be a little bit of a forward-looking discussion, like having to consider some of the topics that we're about to discuss in the open discussion period about things that should be prioritized for the network. So maybe that's a natural segue, but does anyone on the call have any thoughts around how important we feel like this LIP is for reducing gas cost? So yeah, how important it is to push forward this LIP as a top priority versus some of the other things that might be on people's mind that we could be spending time on.
I think this is valuable in the sense that transaction costs have shot up recently a little bit again. I think the average reward cost in US dollars for me for the past 2 weeks was around $10. Where I think it's most valuable is for new orchestrators or orchestrators with a very small amount of LPT that currently disable reward calls on their node, which creates this sort of barrier between the node operator and attracting delegators because they can't enable reward calls because it's not profitable for them. But if they don't enable reward calls, they're unlikely to attract delegation as well. So if we can lower the cost of actually doing these reward calls, then we can open that up to nodes with less staked LPT as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good and interesting point about new orchestrators that have a small amount of stake who are not right now disabling reward calls. And if LIP 56 were to be accepted and implemented, then that would mean that with a reward period of 7 days, you would divide that cost by 7, whatever the current cost is, by 7. And so it all not only results in a lower transaction cost, but because rewards can accumulate over the reward period, it also results in a larger lump sum of rewards that are earned each time, as opposed to like right now, you call reward more frequently and you get a smaller amount of rewards and you pay the transaction cost each time. So there's this batching effect that's beneficial for, in particular for orchestrators that aren't earning as like large rewards on each day, but it could accumulate to a larger amount each week, for example.
If delegators move their stake in the middle of the reward period, would they kind of forgo the rewards they would have been entitled to, you know, during the first few days of that reward period?
The idea of the current design is that they would not.
So making it concrete, 7-day reward period, it's 1 week. If you move your stake on the 6th day, you would still earn that, you would still get the fees and LPT from those first 6 days.
I'd have to double check for moving stake, but if you were to unbond your entire stake on the 6th day, you would still get rewards for those previous 6 days.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd have to double check for moving stake, but implicitly that should be the case as well for the design.
I mean, I think this is like a seemingly easy thing to get feedback on in a very simplified form from the existing set of node operators, which is, you know, let's make it concrete and just say like, if it's a 7-day period, for example, it's like, would you prefer to call reward once a week and reduce your fees for calling reward, you know, 7x, and the drawback is whatever it is. If you stop operating during the week or whatnot, you would forgo some potential rewards. And if people are, you know, in favor of it, we could put more attention to moving it forward quickly, especially like you said, as fees are rising. We haven't heard a lot about the high fees involved in calling rewards as a negative lately, but we did see, like you said, some nodes disable reward calls, even though they were performing well on the performance leaderboard, and that's not great. So yeah, I think we kind of need community sentiment on how important it is, because it's really just a prioritization against the other things that we probably will talk about that could get attention.
I liked how you framed sort of your summary for the LIP. The LIP proposal itself is currently highly technical, but perhaps if we include some more abstract wording, like you mentioned, we can get some more sentiment on that.
Yeah, I would avoid all the discussion around like, and we could consider splitting into 2 LIPs in order to, you know, move the responsibility for issuing tokens out of the minter, and that could be a separate thing. Like, I don't think that's what people want to give feedback on or engage in. I think they just want to know that, hey, this will reduce fees significantly. That's great. Here's the trade-offs. Is that worth it?
Yeah, very good point. Something to be added to the current proposal, definitely.
Yeah, I think I probably just need to like read the technical proposal, but I'd be interested in understanding. I think it's worthwhile understanding some of the, making sure we have some of like the user, like confirmation around some of the user facing implications of the proposal, such as like the questions that Doug asked about. Are we certain that with the current proposal, delegator that moves stake in day 6 will not forego all rewards in the previous days? Because I feel like that might be, because that's a user-facing thing, that might be something to be included in the abstract wording when it comes to gauging community sentiment. And then the blocker there might just be to like have confidence in that instead of like saying that would be the case, but having to retract that later on. So that might be a to-do there as well. Cool. So it feels like, well, yeah, anybody else on the call have any comments? All right, so it feels like on this topic, the to-dos are to confirm some of the answers to the questions around user-facing implications for this proposal. In particular, what happens if delegators move stake in the middle of a round, in the middle of a reward period, and to also create some more abstract wording for the proposal that highlights the user-facing implications as opposed to the technicalities, and use that to gauge community sentiment, likely on Discord. So those feel like the two to-dos here. And maybe as we push into the open discussion period, if we want to loop back about like how we think about this after having talked about the other topics, we can. But those feel like the two immediate to-dos for now. Does that sound right to folks?
Yep. Yeah, and like maybe it's not in the formal proposal, but just somewhere listing out like benefits, drawbacks, right? So that people can have that view when they evaluate.
All right, cool. So that wraps up our small number of LIP candidates for now. We don't have any other outstanding LIPs that we need to talk about. So I think we can segue into the open discussion period where I'm looking at the agenda right now, and we have 3 categories that we've listed out. We'll see how many of those categories we get through. But the 3 categories are updated LPT incentives to better align with useful work. The second is next step in decentralization of governance. And the third one is verification arbitration framework and its dependence on governance. So that might be a good topic to have as a follow-up to the governance category after we highlight kind of some of the directions that we can go in on the governance front and how that, and then talk about how that might influence things that have a governance dependence. So why don't we start with updated LPT incentives to better align with useful work? I think the first topic listed here is what we would need to know in order to determine whether a LIP to allocate a portion of inflation to extra protocol incentive programs is justified. So for background, as most people on the call are probably aware, there is an in-progress community node funded incentive program running until the July 4th, I believe, so for 3 weeks. And this incentive program is using community grant funds in order to allocate additional LPT rewards to top performing orchestrators on the new leaderboard that was shipped in the Explorer 2 weeks ago. So I think the question here is, okay, that program is a nice experiment to get started with. It by no means is probably the perfect solution, but it should give us some learnings around how to best tackle this program going forward. So I think the question is, well, what do we want to know and what do we think we need to know in order to justify kind of continuing some of these extra protocol incentive programs, and whether it makes sense to fund them using inflationary LPT. So that's the background, and I think that's the question that's posed here. So we can open it up for discussion if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I guess we need to know that performing well on whatever like benchmark is being used to distribute the LPT also correlates to performing well on like honest real work through the network. Right, and we're also missing at the moment some indication of the scale and capacity of those doing the work on the network.
Right, so I think that the first thing that you mentioned is related to the conversation that happened in Discord yesterday, I think, around how there was actually some expressed preference for doing well on the leaderboard tests and kind of ignoring some of like the real work that a node is receiving. So maybe we can start there. Yeah, and I definitely agree that we would not want to be in a case where we would want to make sure before allocating inflation to this that like the incentive program is actually resulting in well-performing honest real work. So yeah, does anyone have any like follow-up thoughts on that topic?
But the more I'm thinking about it now, like, while I agree that needs to be solved and like we can dig into that, there's also probably like higher level things to recognize here too. Like we'd also have to know who was going to be responsible for distributing, inflation to the nodes that are, worthy of it, and how the community could trust, that entity or contract or whatever it is to distribute it fairly. And we'd want to know that it, what the like gameability of it would look like, and have a good sense of what sort of incentives are actually created around that.
Right. Do we feel like this is where governance comes into play, where the ability for a community to trust the distribution mechanism that inflation is being allocated toward might depend on like the community's ability to opt in or out of that process? So if the presumption is that this would need to be something that is administered by a single party or a collection of parties, is there a requirement that the community needs to have the ability to like place restrictions on the ability to distribute those funds, whether it be like a rate limit or the ability to kind of revoke access to those funds, to like place some limitations on how much can be distributed at any given point in time?
Yep, or constantly approve new allocations into it as long as the community believes it's doing a good job or something like that. I think that's right.
Right. I have a hard time right now thinking about whether there is a way to do this without a process that looks like that, just simply because we lack the ability to objectively measure these things on chain in a non-gameable way. If we had that, I think that certainly would be the ideal. But at the moment, I'm having trouble thinking about whether that will be feasible in, say, the next 6 months. Right?
It's always helpful to me to look at like a concrete example here. So taken to the extreme, let's say the community said something like 50% of inflation over the next year is going to be, distributed towards as incentives to onboard really great capacity to the network, resulting in, I don't know what it is, like 6% network ownership is going to be distributed through this program or something by year's end. And they approved that all that token was distributed into the control of some entity, be it a DAO or a multi-sig of governors or a single person. And then they would need to feel that entity actually administered the program correctly through this like off-chain distribution mechanic. What's interesting is we see this happen all the time at the beginning of projects. I like don't know how many examples we've seen of this multiple years into a project. Right? Have we seen any of those?
So not quite the same, but well, actually this isn't a good example because it's also a project at launch. But something that came to mind that's similar to what we were talking about here is, I know in the Filecoin ecosystem, so this is a post-launch project, right? So it might not be as relevant, but might be worth mentioning nonetheless. They have a system for cryptographically proving that storage is available and is committed to the network, but there's no good way to verify that useful data is being stored. So you could just be cryptographically proving that you're storing like the most useless data in the world, but obviously there's a difference between storing like highly valuable data for a important customer as opposed to your own data over and over again. And I believe that the way that they're approaching the problem right now is via this, I think it's called Filecoin Plus, but the general idea is that there's a set of, I think they call them notaries. And I think via some governance process, the notaries are given like allocations that they can distribute to certain clients. So let's say I give Doug an allocation of 1,000. Doug is now a notary, and Doug has the ability to allocate those 1,000 units to different clients on the network, basically saying that this is a valuable client, this is a valuable client. And what happens within the protocol is that based on the allocations distributed to clients, if you store data from a client with a higher allocation versus a client with a lower allocation, that impacts the amount of rewards that you receive at the very end. So it's dependent on this governance-centric system where you need to check that the notaries are doing their job properly. And this is something that I think they're still trying to flesh out like what the process for that is. But the assumption is that if a notary is doing a bad job around allocating these units to different clients, then the notary's position is revoked via some governance process. So mapping that back onto the discussion that we're having, the similarities are in that we're talking about a governance process to give someone or a collection of entities the ability to distribute tokens, but also the ability to revoke that permission based on observed performance over time, which is highly subjective, right? This is, I think in both cases, it's not an objective system. It's subjective based on the perception of people that participate in the governance process. So this is something that's, I think they're still working on, and it's a post-launch project, but I feel like it's an example of using a mechanism like this in order to tackle this problem of not being able to verify something objectively. And I don't know if there's any good comparisons with existing projects that have launched for a while because they might not have the same problem, right? They may not have the same problem of trying to allocate certain resources subjectively because there's no good objective, transparent way to verify it otherwise. So yeah, I thought that was worth mentioning as an example that's similar to what we were talking about here, although it's not a project that's launched for a while, it's a post-launch project.
Good example. I think Zcash might have just kind of re-upped or changed the rules around the dev fund allocation on their network. And that might also be an example of like, you know, a project that's been live for 4 years, but the community came together to route funds to something that is under, you know, off-chain control for further distribution. Though they already had the precedent of having a, you know, founders reward or dev fund in the first few years as well.
I think the first step would be, as the first thing you mentioned, Doug, is making sure that the metrics we gather are representative of actual work being done and not people preferring leaderboard work over real jobs. Because before we can make any governance decisions, that would be the main thing that we need. And if we have that, we can there's still a design space there, whether the leaderboard, if it's tied into whatever work a broadcaster node sends into the network, whether it should be tied to that perspective or some other general perspective. And if it's the first, then you don't necessarily need a governance process. Then the broadcasters themselves that send fees into the network can also be the ones allocating LPT to orchestrators that they think performed well for them. That's also another option.
That's really interesting. I was thinking along those lines where the wild idea is like, make LPT a payment mechanism on the network for broadcasting, and just have the tester, the stream tester, pay tremendous fees to the nodes that are retaining the work and performing well. But that would be detectable, because that would be very distinguishable from like real work that was paying lower fees. But your idea of having the like broadcast nodes be the responsible proxies for distributing this as a result of the effectiveness of the work performed, yeah, that's really interesting, because it's aligned.
Yeah, I think that's well, I think first, before getting to that, I think I definitely agree with Nico's point around, before getting to some of the practicalities of how to institute like an inflation-based, like allocating inflation to such a mechanism or such a program, the most important thing is probably establishing credibility in the mechanism first, both in terms of the outcomes that we think it results in, but I think also public like credibility in terms of public perception, because I think that will play an important role in kind of community sentiment around whether this is something that should be funded in this manner. So I think it's important to make sure not only that the outcomes are aligned with the health of the network, but also that this is something that is credible. So it's important for it to be simple enough to understand, and also something that someone would be comfortable placing their trust in.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of an elephant in the room related to that, which is just like the way that the existing stream test harness runs right now. Not that it like suffers from a credibility issue, but it is very arbitrary, right? And it's it's like 3 data centers essentially at the origins of these streams. If you're located near them, you're doing well, but that's not really comprehensive of a global network. It's pretty immature. It's centrally operated. Like a bug or a downtime or something could affect the distribution here. So it's like, we shouldn't start with the assumption that we have a trustworthy objective function for the distribution of these rewards that would actually confer like legitimacy on a much bigger reward distribution program. Maybe you can have one because it can't be objectively determined on chain. And so, like, as you were saying, like established legitimacy might be more of a like social political construct than a objective technology concept.
Right. Yeah, I guess I think about it as like a spectrum of credibility, right? Like obviously the most credible possible thing that you could have is an on-chain mechanism. So that's why on-chain mechanisms are great. But I think the starting point that we are at with the test harness and the leaderboard tests is also acknowledging the practical realities of like what is useful for a video streaming network, right? In that it necessarily needs the intent at the very least was to simulate what a user would see. And obviously right now we're limited by how well we can simulate what a user would see. But at the very least, that's something that can be improved over time. And I feel like that could still add to the credibility of the system. It might not get it to the ideal state, and the ideal state might not be achievable, but kind of on that spectrum, we can still kind of reach for that and kind of make progress towards that. And there might just be a certain threshold that can be crossed such that like this is the point where it has enough credibility such that you can allocate more funds to a system that depends on it. So that's kind of my 2 cents there. I'm not sure we'll ever get to that ideal state, but it feels like this might be the best foundation to start with, acknowledging the practical realities of like what types of outcomes we're trying to achieve in the first place, which ties back to why it's important for the leaderboard tests to correlate well with performing on real work. Because if it doesn't, then yeah, we're probably going towards the wrong outcome.
Yeah, I don't really know the next action here. It might just be that people digest and someone, moves towards a draft proposal, even if it's not formal yet, but just an informal proposal for ideas, rather than discussing in the abstract.
I suspect that the thing that would help answering this question the most is looking at, like concretely speaking, is looking at the metrics from each round of the current experimental incentive program. While it might not be indicative, like exactly indicative of what one might see if we were to allocate like a larger amount of funds towards such a program. But I think that's kind of the best source of like concrete data to use. Because then otherwise, in absence of that, I'm not sure if there's any way to kind of avoid the kind of abstract conversation, because it's always like, in theory, like someone should be incentivized to do this, but I think we're probably also missing a lot of other factors that someone might take into consideration outside of just the fact that they can earn some speculative LPT. Right, so maybe for this question we can, maybe for this question, I feel like this discussion was good and I jotted down some notes, but maybe it's something that we can come back to, acknowledging that we want to see some of the key metrics from at least the first few rounds of the incentive program. And the ones that we'll be focused on right now are, I think, percentage, so stake movement based upon the results of the leaderboard, the use of the LPT that's given out as a part of the reward distribution. So the percentage staked afterwards versus not staked, and the change in performance scores over the course of a given week. So I think in the current set of rules, it's based on a threshold score and the top performers in each region. And there was an assessment of how many met those threshold scores at the start of the week. So I think we'd want to see what the change looks like on a week-by-week basis. And then maybe after we have those data points, we can come back to this question with some, at least some evidence to work with.
I think one addition to make there on a more technical level, I guess, is that we can also look into what it would take to track metrics per orchestrator for a broadcaster. I know one of the technical things holding us back there is high cardinality of Prometheus labels, but perhaps there's something we can do there. And if we can have per orchestrator stats or per orchestrator metrics on Prometheus for a broadcaster, then we can perhaps look into tying the leaderboard metrics into real streams.
Mm-hmm. So the thought there is that you use the metrics recorded from kind of regular streams that are being sent in anyway, as opposed to kind of making this distinction between a leaderboard test stream and other streams. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There would likely be additional things we need to track there as amount of work performed by a node, because that will probably end up being different for each node, as not each node will receive an equal amount of streams, stuff like that. But I think that would be a good evolvement of the leaderboard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That's something that I think there's technical questions that we would need to answer, but it's certainly something that we can look into as we evolve this first program and see if that is something that helps us reason about the current question around like what we need to determine in order to create a LIP to allocate a portion of inflation to these types of programs. Cool. If there isn't anything additional on this question, I wanted to just make note of one other point that I added for this category of LPT incentives, and it's the usefulness, well, first off, whether automated delegation may be helpful for network incentives. And depending on the answer to that question, the usefulness of core protocol changes in order to make it easier to create automated delegators. So for background, the reason I'm mentioning this is so one way that LPT gets routed to well-performing nodes on the network, or in theory gets routed to well-performing nodes on the network, is via delegation. So delegation will control how much LPT rewards are available to any particular orchestrator, and then the orchestrator is able to take a cut of that lump sum amount. So that's an existing mechanism that is available. However, I don't believe we've seen a substantial amount of, we've seen some delegation activity since the leaderboard launched, but we historically, I don't think have seen a substantial amount of delegation activity such that we can say that, oh, this is a mechanism that helps route LPT rewards reliably to the best performing nodes. So that kind of raises a question of like, well, does that mean that the delegation mechanism is something that cannot be relied on generally? Or is there are there still like unexplored paths for kind of making that delegation mechanism more useful? And what's interesting is that in the DeFi space, there's been this whole trend of basically projects built on top of DeFi projects in order to optimize for capital allocation. So I think Yearn is a good example where in the Yearn ecosystem, people create these strategies implemented as contracts that anyone can deposit funds into, and then the strategy implemented will try to allocate that capital across different DeFi projects to maximize yield. And then some strategies might be based on certain metrics and some strategies might be based on other metrics, but you have your pick of the crop. You can decide where you put your capital in, and then the strategies will allocate it in an automated fashion. So it's kind of like the next step after acknowledging that like, oh, it's important that capital is allocated efficiently, and this just makes capital allocation more efficient. Not too dissimilar from like if people are familiar in like the real traditional finance world, the rise of robo-advisors and how they took off. A lot of people wanted to invest their money. They didn't invest their money until robo-advisors came around because they just automate that process. So that's the backdrop. And I was just thinking about, well, how does that map to like delegation? So if you could more automate delegation, would that be helpful in reducing some of like the frictions in like someone having to decide on any given day who to delegate to, and instead having it be automated based on certain rules and like pooling that together as well, so that people don't have to think about like, oh, do I have to split accounts? Like I want like 500K to this node, but I want 250K to this node. That's a very manual process right now. But I guess imagine a world where that could be fully automated, where based on like a predefined set of rules, you'll split like the total LPT that you have accordingly. And the reason that might be helpful is, well, we haven't seen the delegation mechanism route LPT really well to nodes that perform well. But could it be the case with more frictionless mechanisms such as this existing that we see improvements on that end? I'm not sure, but I think it might be possible. So that's the first question. And the second question is, well, if we do think this is useful, what is necessary in order to do it? Because I think this is probably something that could be like executed on independently, but is there anything that would be need to be changed in the core protocol to make this easier for like a third-party developer? So we don't need to like do a complete deep dive here, but I wanted to introduce this topic to people and see if there's any initial thoughts or reactions to it.
I think the vertical of building automated delegation for LivePeer is something that should be built as by the community as a product or by some company as a product. I don't think it's ideal that we do that ourselves. What I think is a major bottleneck there is that if you want to currently delegate towards multiple orchestrators, is that you have to do that from separate addresses, as well as the gas cost associated with sequentially bonding to another account. And once we solve that and make it really cost effective to be able to stake towards multiple orchestrators within one transaction, I think we could see some interesting things being built on top of that. One of the things I had in mind for Tenderize, for example, was that it would sort of gather rewards from an index fund of orchestrators. But the thing that made it unfeasible to actually implement doing that for multiple orchestrators is the gas cost associated with bonding to multiple ones, and then getting rewards back and stuff like that. So I think being able to efficiently manage multiple delegations to different orchestrators is probably the main bottleneck in getting some things built on top of that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's kind of why I posed the question of, well, if we think this is useful and this is something that could be built extra protocol, what are the core protocol changes, if any, that might be necessary in order to actually facilitate in that first place? And I feel like in order to answer that question, we also need to decide like how useful like automated delegation could be, because then that would inform like how to prioritize any core protocol changes that might be necessary in order for automated delegation to be realized in practice, right? So that's kind of why I suggested maybe we should answer the question of like how useful we think it would be in practice first, and then use that as a segue to determine, okay, it's useful, but like what are the blockers in order for this to be realized in practice, whether it be by like the core team or a third-party team.
I would even take a step back from automated delegation and just call it multi-orchestrator delegation. And what you can do with that is a regular delegator can delegate to multiple orchestrators, but it could also be automated, or there could be a set managed by governance. Whatever is built on top of that can be built, but the main thing is being able to delegate towards multiple orchestrators. And that's not only for automated delegation, but also existing delegators on the network as well.
Yeah, sure. I think those all kind of like fall into this category of enabling more efficient delegation mechanisms. And I guess the reason to highlight automation is just that, and I think a contributing factor here might just be like the difficulty that there is today for delegating to multiple orchestrators. So I certainly think that's a contributing factor. But I think the reason for maybe emphasizing automation is that we haven't seen too much manual action regardless of your ability to delegate to multiple orchestrators or not, right? Like I don't think we've seen too much evidence of like, even given the ability to delegate a single orchestrator, a substantial amount of delegation activity. So that was my main reason for maybe like highlighting the automated part. But I think all the other points that you brought up as well kind of fall under this general bucket of like how useful it is for more efficient delegation mechanisms. And yeah.
Another mechanism that might be interesting along these lines might be like a delegator defined reward cut. So for example, if there was a pool of token, an incentive pool of token aimed at rewarding orchestrators who are performing well, and that pool of token and the mechanism for distribution was just staking towards the nodes that were performing well, but you could do so with, say, 100% reward cut, then that would really like juice the rewards each rounds for the nodes that were being staked towards by this pool of token. while also creating a flexible mechanism to, you know, allow other things to be built. It could be automated, it could be manual, it could be what have you. I have to think more about it, but it might be just like what the orchestrator sets as their floor, so they can attract as much stake as possible. But this could be used to facilitate LPT distribution.
Right. Just to make sure I understand correctly, the idea is, so right now, orchestrators set their reward cut and delegators take that into consideration. When they're delegating, your suggestion would be also allowing the delegator to define the reward cut themselves. So regardless of what the orchestrator might still define a reward cut.
Higher than whatever the orchestrator set it at.
Right. So like the baseline is that the orchestrator will take that amount from my share, but I can also set it to be higher. So I give the orchestrator a higher share.
Yeah, and it basically like routing rewards from a pool to that node every day. Maybe it's a bad idea. Just throwing it out there.
Right. So, okay, so we've talked a little bit about automated delegation, more efficient delegation mechanisms. And I think we've also highlighted that a potential blocker for any of these things really is the gas efficiency of implementing it. And I think this is more applicable for the cases where you might want to delegate to multiple orchestrators than it is for like a single orchestrator use case. But I think it holds for both of them. Like I think gas efficiency will probably matter regardless. It just matters more for the multiple orchestrator case. So I feel like given that, I feel like that there is potential here. I don't know. I don't think on this call we're going to determine if this is kind of like one of the most important things that we could be working on, but it feels like a next step here might be to evaluate, maybe jot down all of these potential mechanisms that are worthwhile exploring, and then identifying like the commonalities between them in terms of requirements. So with a particular eye on gas efficiency. So it might be the case that improving gas efficiency in one area makes all of these mechanisms more feasible, or only makes a single of them more feasible. So that feels like that could be the next step here. I don't know if I don't think we're gonna kind of isolate all of them right now, but just some of the ones that I jotted down were automated delegation, easier multi-delegation to different orchestrators, and also delegator defined reward cut. Do we think that there's anything else missing from there? Cool. So those are the three that I jotted down. And yeah, maybe I think the to-dos here are, okay, given these three that we think that there's potential for, obviously one step is to kind of continue the deep thought around like how useful it would be in practice, but also identify what requirements likely from a gas efficiency standpoint would need to be fulfilled in order to realize any of these, if not all of them. All right, we only have 3 minutes left in the hour. And we had two categories that we did not cover. Doug, I know that you had brought up the next step in decentralization of governance. Do you want to highlight anything in the kind of the last remaining minutes that we have, or maybe save that for next time?
I think it's a big topic that we'll have to save for next time, but I think the highlight is I see like 3 different next steps we could take. One is moving to full binding on-chain voting as a first step, and that kind of accomplishes full decentralization with the governance of the protocol. It's a big step from there. The community could use that to take any subsequent steps. That's like the biggest possible thing we could do. The smallest possible thing that we could do is that the community could just ratify the process and election of the multi-stakeholders who control the protocol, just so that there was a clear and known process for how those multi-stakeholders get approved or revoked. And that would still be like full community decentralization and consensus around how the protocol is operated and governed, though in practicality, there's still this kind of like central execution step. And then a third option is a hybrid, which is at the same time, you do binding on-chain voting, but you also have the community ratify like a security committee that looks out for bugs, can still take, you know, multi-sig based fast action to fix things. But they, yeah, that would be like, again, like a consensus-based ratification of a process that's gives the protocol some protections for the current phase, but also enables the on-chain execution of, you know, any proposals that pass in an automated way. So I think those are like the three next steps that I see. If anyone has others, you know, please add a note or a comment or share in the governance channel. But I think we should look at those and consider what we want the next step to be.
Sounds good. And I feel like that summary might be a good place to put a pause on this conversation and wrap up the call for today. So thanks everyone for taking the time. The recording of this will be posted, and I'll also clean up the notes and add them to the community governance repository as well. Thanks everyone, and see you on the next call.
Thanks for hosting.
Yep,
Bye,
see you
everybody.
later.